Evening. You got a Bible with you? Go ahead and be turning to Matthew chapter 13, as it says on the screen. That's where we'll be spending our time this evening. I will forewarn you, this is not a typical sermon for me, so I'm trying something new, and we're going to see how it goes, but hopefully it goes okay, and we all learn a little bit of something. Originally, I was going to speak on the parable of the sower, and then I found out that Mike talked about it a month and a half ago. So I decided to do more of an overview of this great chapter. As Ben read for us, it starts with the parable of the sower, but Matthew uses the 13th chapter, as we have it in our English Bibles, to talk about the kingdom of God in 7 different ways, using 7 different parables. As we go through our scripture reading this year, we're starting out in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts, right? The first 3 books of the New Testament, and then the 5th one. We'll get to John later on. But as we're going through these Gospels and the book of Acts, one common theme you find popping up over and over again, and really the theme of the whole New Testament, is this idea of God's kingdom. One of the most important themes, maybe even the most important theme, throughout the entire New Testament. If you want to think about it, the Gospels introduce the kingdom. Acts shows you how the kingdom started on earth, or the earthly representation of the kingdom came about, being the church. And Romans through Revelation tells you how to act in that kingdom. It's a basic outline of the New Testament for you. Very basic, but it works. The kingdom of God is highly important, but it's God's kingdom. And it doesn't really exist here. We have a physical representation of it, but the full thing doesn't exist here on earth. It's God's. It's in God's mind. How are we to understand it? Jesus talks about it being a mystery. It's been a mystery through all the prophets in the Old Testament. There's constantly language of secrets being kept, and we don't know God's full mind. Well, Matthew 13 is where God decides to step down and explain it to us. I want to tell you 7 truths about the kingdom tonight, found one in each of the parables of Matthew chapter 13. And so first, let me summarize all of the parables that are in Matthew 13. If you're unfamiliar with the chapter, hopefully you've at least heard of most of these before. But the first parable Jesus tells is the parable of the sower. I'm sorry that font is so small. I had to change it at the last moment, and that didn't transfer over. My bad. The first parable is the parable of the sower, told in Matthew 13, verses 3 through 9, with an explanation of that parable in verses 18 through 23. In between those 2 sections, Jesus explains why he's using parables and how to, like what they mean and what their purpose is. I'm not going to talk about that. That's for your own study. Tonight we're just looking at the parables. The second parable he tells is the parable of the wheat and the tares, found in chapter 13, verses 24 through 30, with an explanation for that found in verses 37 through 43. Now, in between those 2 sections, the giving of the parable and the explanation, there are actually 2 parables found inside that. And that's important. We'll talk about that in a minute. First one is the parable of the mustard seed, found in verse 31 and 32. Second one is the parable of the leaven, that's found in verse 33. Then we have 3 more later on in the chapter. Verse 44, Jesus talks about the treasure hidden in the field. Verses 45 and 46, Jesus talks about the pearl of great price, as we often call it. And then last of all, it wraps up in verses 47 through 50, as Jesus talks about the parable of the net, or the dragnet. I like the word dragnet, so I put it up there. That's the only reason I put it there. I just like it. Those are your 7 parables, each telling you something different, some different facet of what the kingdom of heaven is. It's important to establish these, and it's also going to be important to establish a basic structure before we get to the parables themselves, because the structure itself will have some implication for how I interpret them and for how I understand them. And so, there's the basic content. Let's talk briefly about the structure before we read some of these parables and go through them. As far as structure goes, unsure at best. Let's put it that way. I read it. I read chapter 13 a few times, and I had my own vague outline of maybe this is how this could work. And then I looked at one commentator who had a different view, and then I looked at a second commentator who had a very different view, and then I looked at a third and a fourth, and they all had different views. And it turns out basically everyone seems to have their own outline of how these 7 parables fit together. And they come down into 2 basic categories. Either the parables are separate and not connected at all, or they are connected, and Jesus has put them around the theme. If they're not connected, that's your outline, those 7. But given the similarities between all of them, I would say they are connected, which leads me to believe this is a basic structure for how Jesus is organizing his parables. Firstly, he talks about the sower. This one's separate from all the others. If you notice, look down in verse 24. Jesus presented another parable to them, and he said, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field." Look at verse 31. "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed." Look at verse 33. "The kingdom of heaven is like leaven." 44. "The kingdom of heaven is like treasure." 45. "The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant." Verse 47. "The kingdom of heaven is like a large net thrown into the sea." But you notice in verse 3, when he starts the first parable, the sower parable, he doesn't say the kingdom of heaven is like a sower. He says, consider the sower. Because the sower is an introduction to this section. It stands by itself, and yes, it's connected to the others, and the themes play throughout the entire chapter, but it is not part of a larger section. It is the introduction to them all. Then, and I'm not sure how best to go about this, but here's the outline that I think Jesus is following. I'll just give it to you all at once, and you can watch it play out. Oh, I did that. That's brilliant. Okay, good. Jesus puts parables 2 and 7 together. The parable of the tares is ultimately talking about the final judgment. We find that out in the interpretation that's in verses 37 through 43. The parable of the dragnet, 47 through 50, is also talking about final judgment. And within the context of judgment, Jesus places 2 sets of pairs that talk about similar ideas. The mustard seed and the leaven both talk about growth, and the hidden treasure and the pearl of great price both talk about seeking and giving up what's valuable for the kingdom of heaven. With that in mind, let's talk about some truths that Jesus tells us about the kingdom of heaven. You can agree with that, or you can not agree with that. You can bring me a different outline, and by all means, let's talk about it. But ultimately, Jesus is talking about the kingdom. So as we think through this, let's talk about the kingdom. And that brings me to truth number 1 that Jesus gives you. The kingdom produces fruit for God. Verses 3 through 9. Let's read those again. Jesus told them many things in parables, saying, "Consider the sower who went out to sow. As he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seed fell on the rocky ground, where it didn't have much soil, and it grew up quickly since the soil wasn't deep. But when the sun came up, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Now other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns came up and choked it. Still other seed fell on good ground, and produced fruit. Some 100, some 60, and some 30 times what was sown. Let anyone who has ears listen." The kingdom of heaven, truth number 1, the kingdom of heaven produces fruit for God. This is the parable of the sower, a man who is working with God's word, and he scatters it abroad to everyone, to every type of soil, in the hope that he gets a crop out of it. And what's the response he gets? He gets a few different ones, because the kingdom gets different responses from different types of people, from different types of hearts. And so the first one, the wayside, are the people that hear the word, but they don't really listen to it. They don't incorporate anything about it. It's in one ear, out the other, and they don't ultimately care. The second type of soil, the rocky ones, are the ones who listen and who get really excited about Christianity and walk into it and then walk out. And there's no real fruit. It looked like it was growing something, but not really. These are the people who have listened, but they didn't learn anything. Then you have the third type of soil, the thorny soil, the people who have listened and have taken it to heart and who have started down the pathway, but then something else comes up and they get distracted and they get dragged away. The thorny soil, the ones who learn but aren't loyal. However, There's a fourth group, the good seed, the good soil, the people who hear, but also listen, who take it to heart, who learn what they're supposed to do, and who are loyal to what God asks them to do. And that's the response the sower is looking for. The kingdom of heaven produces fruit in the right type of people, in the people who have good hearts. Truth number one, the kingdom produces fruit for God. And truth number two plays right into that, because it's along the same theme, in that the kingdom produces fruit without first judging it. What do I mean by that? Look at the parable of the tares. Verse 24. Jesus presented another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while the people were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and left. When the plant sprouted and produced grain, then the weeds also appeared. And the landowner's servants came to him and said, "Master, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" And he told them, "An enemy did this." "So do you want us to go and pull them up?" the servants asked him. "No," he said. "Well, when you pull up the weeds, you might also uproot the wheat with them. No, rather let both grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I'll tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and tie them in bundles to burn them, but collect the wheat into my barn." What is this parable talking about? Thankfully, there's an interpretation of this later on in the chapter, and this is what Jesus ultimately says, this is about the sower, the Son of Man, scattering good seed, but then Satan comes in and disrupts it. But God's not willing to destroy the evil and the righteous. God helps both of them. What does that look like? Well, the sower sows good seed. He's found the good soil, right? He puts the seed in the soil, the seed grows up, but meanwhile, Satan sneaks in and puts some weeds in there. Tares are plants that look like wheat until they're grown and until they flower, and then you realize the fruit that they produce is not the fruit of the grain that you want. But at that point, their roots are so deeply entangled, you can't pull up one without the other. God's answer is not to destroy everyone. God's answer is, we don't judge now. Let them grow, and we'll deal with them later. In the final judgment, God will make things work out. He'll judge eventually, not on our time, but on His. The kingdom produces fruit for God, but this fruit is produced, there's good and evil in the same area. Now, let me clarify that. God's people produce good fruit. The kingdom produces good fruit. But anytime that there is something good on earth, Satan will infiltrate it and try to do evil. And so the evil that is produced is not from God or God's people, but it's from the hypocrites who are kind of like God's people, but they're not in their hearts. Think about the rocky soil and the thorny soil. Both of them grew some, and yet neither of the good soil that God's looking for. God's people produce good, but in the kingdom, there are all sorts of fruit that are propping up that God will judge in the last days. And that's all right. Now within the parable being given and the parable being interpreted, given that the interpretation's about judgment, look at parable number 3 in light of that. Verses 31 and 32. Jesus presented another parable to them. Now the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it's grown, it's taller than the garden plants and becomes a tree so that the birds of the sky come and nest in its branches. What's he talking about? Well, the kingdom has visible growth, outward growth, and it's easy to see things happening on the outside. What happens when you plant a tree? You plant a small sapling, and then you wait however many months, and then the springtime comes and it starts to flower. It starts to bud, and it starts to sprout. And you can see growth happening as a tree goes from being very small to being taller than we all are. You can see outward changes happening. The kingdom has an outward growth. And it sprouts up into a nicely sized tree, a bush, or however you want to think about it, about 12 feet tall. So not a super impressive tree, not like a redwood, but bigger than me. So there's that. And you notice the product of this growth. The product of the tree is shelter for the birds to provide for them. Yes, the kingdom starts small, but it grows and you can see it. That growth provides good things to other people. The kingdom has visible growth, fruit visible out in the world. Maybe it looks like us going out and teaching people. Maybe it looks like people coming to us and being taught. Maybe it looks like numerical growth. Whatever it is, the kingdom has visible growth. But the flip side of that is verse 33 with the fourth parable where Jesus says, by the way, the kingdom also has invisible growth. Verse 33, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and mixed into 50 pounds of flour until all of it was leavened. What is leaven? How does that work? Have you baked bread before? My family grew up baking bread. My older sister got into it like 15 years ago now, so I've just grown up with bread being made all the time. I know vaguely how leaven works, and by that I mean I have no idea, but it makes the bread get bigger, right? How does leaven work? Do you get to watch the bread sprout flowers like a tree would? Do you get to watch the bread as it gets larger and grows and blossoms like a tree? No, but when you come back after 40 minutes, there's a marked difference in what it is versus what it was. And it's the same with the kingdom of heaven. Yes, there may be stuff that we see. Yes, there may be people coming into our doors. Yes, there may be people joining the church here. But also there's a lot of internal growth and invisible growth as people learn and become better Christians and better followers of Christ. And I can't see that. I hope and I pray that people are learning and growing. I can't see that, but God can. And think about this in the context as Matthew has organized it in the context of final judgment with the tares parable. Ultimately, whether it's external growth or internal growth, whether it's visible or invisible, whether it's on the surface here or it's internal in our hearts, I'm not the final judge, but God is. And God will sort out the good growth from the bad. God sees the growth that's happening, whether it's visible to human eyes or not. But I'm not the judge, and God is. There's another view of this that many of the commentators take, which is, and I'll give you this view for what it's worth. I'm not sure I hold to it, but it's an interesting thought as well. You know how the tares was talking, there's good seed and bad seed, there's good fruit and bad fruit? A lot of commentators look at leaven and they say, you know, leaven in the Bible is never a good thing. Think about it. The Passover requires unleavened bread because leaven is wrong, and you're supposed to clear out your entire house so that there's no leaven in the house when you make unleavened bread for Passover. Why is that? That's what God said, but also leaven isn't great. When Jesus needs an example to think about the Pharisees' false teaching, what does he say? He says, beware the leaven of the Pharisees, right? And there are a couple more examples like that. Leaven is typically associated with something that's not good. And so, perhaps another way to understand the seed and the leaven is there is good growth, there is bad growth. Whether it's internal, or whether it's outward or inward, internal or external, positive growth or negative growth, the good seed or the bad seed, whatever it is, it's in the context of God judges. I don't know which one's right. I've only heard the first one. I haven't heard the leaven being bad theory before. But either way, it's the same truth, is that God judges. And it will all work out in the end. What can we do then? I can't fully judge others because I don't see their hearts. I don't know everything that's going on. What is my responsibility? It's the responsibility of the person in parables 5 and 6. The pair of 5 and 6, the hidden treasure and the merchant finding the pearl. Because it turns out, truth number 5 about the kingdom of heaven is that the kingdom is open to anyone who finds it. Look at verse 44. The kingdom of heaven, it's like treasure hidden in a field that a man found and reburied, and then in his joy he goes and sells everything he has and buys that field. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure. The treasure is the main character here. It's hidden, but it's also available if anyone finds it. It's kind of like the parables themselves, right? Truths that are kind of hidden, but if you look hard enough, they're there and they're findable. This guy, just in the course of his everyday life, stumbles across the kingdom. And he says, well, that's worth everything. He sacrifices all of his money, all of his possessions. He sacrifices everything he has to go and find that treasure. The kingdom is valuable, but it's also open for anyone who wants to come in. For anyone who wants to join, the kingdom allows them to. But what type of person is the kingdom really looking for? What type of person is the kingdom really seeking? That's truth number 6, is that the kingdom is grasped by its seekers. Look at verses 45 and 46. The pearl of great price. Well, that's what we usually call it. But Jesus says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. When he found one priceless pearl, he went and sold everything he had and bought it. What's the kingdom like? Is it like the pearl? Is it like the valuable thing? Yes, but that's not the focus Jesus puts on it. He's focusing on the merchant in this story. I would argue this isn't the pearl of great price. This is the story of the merchant finding the pearl. It's not going to stick because it doesn't flow as well, and it's not common, but I think it's accurate. Is that the merchant is the focus of this story. We focused on the treasure and the value itself in parable number 5. Now think about the heart required to claim that value. The one who seeks diligently. This is a guy, it's not that he stumbled across it accidentally like the man in the field. This is a man in search of pearls, and he's going through them one by one. When he finally finds the super valuable one, he sacrifices everything to get it. What's the character of someone who's in the kingdom? Someone who's seeking, someone who's asking, someone who's knocking at the door, like Jesus says in Matthew 7. Nothing's going to hold this person back. He's seeking out the truth. And the kingdom is open to anyone who wants to come, but the only people who really anchor in, the only people who really produce something, the only good soil are the seekers who are going after God, even though the thorny soil and the rocky soil is allowed in, and the wayside is allowed if they would hear it. But the kingdom is grasped by its seekers. And then the good news. Jesus ends off. It's a kind of a pessimistic view to end off on for parable number 7, but I'm going to take the optimistic view of it, which is that this kingdom is a blessing to the righteous people. Look at verse 47. Again, the kingdom of heaven, it's like a large net thrown out into the sea. It collected every kind of fish, and when it was full, they dragged it ashore and sat down. They gathered the good fish into containers and threw out the worthless ones. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will go out and separate the evil people from the righteous and throw them into the blazing furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's kind of a sad ending there, but what is God doing? Again, it's back to the parable of the tares. There is a final judgment. The dragnet is coming. It's the main character. It catches all of the fish and brings them in, whether they're good or bad. Whatever type of fish, whatever style you prefer, they're all in there. They're all dragged ashore, and then God ultimately sorts it out. The angels go and separate the good and the bad, the evil and the righteous. The pickup is indiscriminate. Anyone can go. Anyone is welcome. But when he sorts out good from righteous, that is very discriminate. He finds the righteous people, the seekers, the good soil, who have gone after him, God finds those who are emulating him and living like his son, and he takes them for salvation. The wicked are lost, but the righteous are saved. The kingdom is a blessing on the righteous. What Jesus tells you about the kingdom here is summarized in these points. That the kingdom produces fruit for God, all types of it, good, and then the hypocrites who creep in there, and they're the bad ones, but God's going to judge that. God's going to judge outward growth, which we all see. God's going to judge inward growth, which we don't see. God's going to judge good or bad. Whatever fruit they're producing, God sees it, and maybe I don't, but God does. And he will judge in the end. So make sure you find the kingdom. And not just find the kingdom, make sure you search after the kingdom, and you actively seek it, and you dedicate yourself to cultivating the right heart, the good soil that's diligent and self-sacrificing, so that in the end, God will sort you as righteous, and you'll be blessed and benefited by the kingdom that he's given you. It's Matthew 13 in a nutshell. And of course, there's so much more, and there's more to delve into, and there's stories after that and a couple things in between there. But there are 7 truths about the kingdom, and hopefully that's something beneficial to meditate on. But do you want to know an 8th truth about the kingdom? This one's free. This one's not in the chapter. But do you want to know an 8th one, an extra one, a bonus one? The kingdom of heaven is a free gift that God offered to us. He showed us his intentions. He tells us much about it. He tells us the good. He tells us the challenges. He's very open about what goes into the kingdom, and he offers it freely to anyone who wants to take it. Are we listening to the facts God's given? Do we have the heart to listen to it? Not to just hear it, but to listen. To be able to learn, to be loyal and dedicate ourselves to God. What can we do to be a part of this kingdom? The fruit-bearing work, where we can bear fruit for the glory of God and show his majesty to the world, and ultimately end up in his kingdom saved by his grace and his mercy. Is there anything you need to get on that path, to be part of the kingdom, to give yourself to God? If there's anything we can do, you can catch me afterwards, or I'll be standing right here as we stand and sing this song.